Hey guys, today we continue in the 1950s to present in Pennsylvania. We will be talking about the civil rights movement. Civil rights in general, you can think of civil meaning like citizens. Rights, you can think of like moral and legal entitlements, like what you can actually do. This is also a time associated mostly with African Americans, but there are other marginalized groups fighting for equal rights at this time and equal opportunities. And you can even say that this fight is not just exclusive to like the 40s to 80s. This is when we recognize a lot of victories, but this civil rights have been fought for since the founding of Pennsylvania. The Quakers were some of the earliest abolitionists. In fact, we get the first petition at that time from them. But that's not to say that some Quakers and even William Penn didn't own slaves. It's more ambiguous than that. And on that note, you have to think Pennsylvania as well was one of the more tolerant states. We did have a strong civil rights movement throughout our history, especially in Philadelphia. Pennsylvania was a destination for those escaping slavery, and even a place where citizens would defend them to the death. But we were still touched with that Jim Crow spirit. We did fight a civil war. Those enslaved would be free, but we still had some policies and practices in our own state. Most people do associate Jim Crow with the South, but it would also be in Pennsylvania. We would see glimpses of that. We did have segregation, and for a time we didn't have black students going to school in Pittsburgh. We did have sundown towns, which, whether on purpose or by accident, whether it's legal policy or just common practice, black people would not be allowed in certain towns, or they could only be in for a certain time, and then they'd hear a bell or a whistle, there's some sort of curfew, and they would have to get out. Maybe the criteria for the alleged sundown town is that no black family has ever lived there. Maybe it just worked out that way. Sometimes some of the towns on these lists that you can find online were on purpose. We would have our own conflicts, several lynchings, and then also some race riots in and around Philadelphia area. But Pennsylvania moved a lot quicker than some other states, at least legally, to get rid of Jim Crow policies, to attempt to provide equal opportunities, to get kids in schools, to allow black passengers in all different forms of transportation, to allow them in restaurants and other public areas. But anyway, that should have been all the stuff that you remember from the Civil War and Reconstruction period that we were talking about in Pennsylvania. Other things to keep in mind during this time period was the rise of birth control, women's rights movement, the Cold War, of course, Vietnam, activism, skepticism of government, especially with Nixon, Watergate, the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, Pentagon Papers, MK Ultra, the rise of suburbs and white flight, where in response to many African Americans moving to cities, you have many white families moving out and into suburbs, consumerism, a rise in liberalism, but also a rise in conservatism, so we will become polarized. But then also assassinations of JFK, and then also Robert Kennedy, and also Malcolm X, and also Martin Luther King. It was a time of legislation for the civil rights movement, such as the Voting Rights Act. But remember, laws only matter if they're enforced. And before we get into the content, let's look at the Bellringer. Number 1. Are there any groups today that are treated unequally? What groups have you noticed that are maybe marginalized, that maybe are discriminated against, that maybe don't have equal opportunities, or something you see on Facebook, TV, you hear your parents talk about? Let me know what groups and in what ways. If you say no, everybody's good, everybody's peachy and perfect, then that's fine too. Give me that answer. Number 2. What are some causes worth fighting for today? As I said before, one of the themes of this time is just activism. So many people getting involved, doing something, protesting, and the other techniques that they would use. So, what do you think? Alrighty, let's get started. For much of US history, and then partially for PA history, we had this idea of segregation, that whites and blacks would be separated. We do get the Supreme Court case, Plessy vs. Ferguson, which would say that that's okay as long as things are equal. You can have this separate school, you can be separated in public, and whether it's a dining room or even bathrooms. As long as you're providing them, that's fine. But it was never actually equal. In fact, many times it was a very crude version of what the other group would have. This was done legally or even by just common practice, and clearly it would have a negative impact on so many people. This impacted their education, their housing, transportation, their careers, their rights, and much more. You have this idea of the American dream that, you have your own choices, you can make your own life, you just have to work hard and you can be successful. And there's so much truth in that, right? The only thing is, well, maybe on this track to success you didn't provide any shoes, and then you have all these hurdles. In fact, maybe you just have a rope on that person to hold them back, that they have to struggle much harder than other people would. So essentially it's a rigged game. But eventually we get the Supreme Court to go back on this ruling under Brown versus Board of Education, where this would stop segregation. We would integrate schools, but it didn't necessarily end segregation everywhere else. And then also, as we try to integrate schools and have white kids and black kids go to school together, in some places they didn't enforce it. This was somewhat common, and it would actually take, in some instances like Little Rock, the army to come down and force schools and the communities to allow kids to go to school. One important thing to remember is that sitting back and hoping for what's right isn't always the thing to do if you want to get something done. Many times, or even most times in history, people actually have to fight for this stuff. We don't always have schools or businesses or government doing what's right. Sometimes citizens have to make some noise or force the government or business to do these things. Legislation and action to improve black equality came from activism at this time, such as protests, marches, rallies, speeches, boycotts, and sit-ins. These are some of the different methods at the time that people used to foster change. Protests and marches would be done in Pennsylvania, whether it was at the Capitol or even at some businesses that either treated people a certain type of way or wouldn't hire you based on your race. One example is at the A&P stores. And when these are done effectively, you go out of business or you start hiring black people. There would also be rallies and some civil rights leaders that would give speeches and have music and even go to schools to educate children. Now, as we learned before, Pennsylvania is a pretty good state, pretty tolerant, and you can feel some pride in our values opposed to some other states, but that doesn't mean that Pennsylvania did go unblemished. We did have some small conflicts, such as in suburbs and redlining, discrimination in jobs, and some other instances of discrimination. But for the most part, Pennsylvania is pretty good. And while segregation and Jim Crow and race riots are associated in the South, this would happen in the North as well. Because of their fights, from the 1950s on, and you can say from the start of Pennsylvania, black Americans would make impressive social and economic gains. But full equality remains an unwritten chapter. The fight still goes on. So let's take some time to look at Levittown, Pennsylvania. Levittown was a planned residential community in Bucks County, so a little northeast of Philadelphia. It was developed in the early 1950s by building contractor William Levitt, who had already constructed one Levittown in New York. He did another one in New Jersey, and essentially they were these cookie cutter towns that pretty much when you think of a suburb, this is what it is. It was an attractive community, and it spread over 6,000 acres of farmland. Yards and public areas were landscaped, streets would be curved, and had very few four-way intersections. They would have their own schools, they donated land for churches, they would have their own shopping centers. Levittown, Pennsylvania would have 5 swimming pools and a community center. Volunteers and municipal officials would establish a library and even parks. And it does sound so attractive, but the one catch was that it was an all-white community and on purpose. African Americans were legally kept out of Levittown and other suburbs. This practice would be known as redlining, and it would basically keep black families in certain areas and not give the same access as they would different families such as white families, and it would restrict black families from moving in certain areas, or at least would make it difficult or impossible. And if you contrast that with a white family, they would be able to get into certain areas that a black family wouldn't. And even when this does become illegal, it would still be common practice to find other ways, such as intimidation. Redlining would also involve racist loan lending practices. Many white families flocked to Levittown, while other black families would pretty much only have options in cities. Another large portion of the people in Levittown actually came from the anthracite coal region, because that area, like Shamokin at the time, would be in the decline, and families would get out of there. They would move to Levittown, have other opportunities, and often they were referred to as coal crackers. Now in 1957, the Meyers family would provoke a challenge to some in the Levittown community. The Meyers were a black family with 3 children that moved to Levittown, and they buy the place off their friend. The father was a World War II veteran, and once he moved in, him and his family were faced with approximately 600 from Levittown that were having an orderly meeting and were petitioning and protesting outside to stop the mixing of races in their closed community. You can check out the video that interviews residents. There was a lot of mixed feelings, some supporting the Meyers, some saying, I don't care as long as they're a good citizen and a good person, and some saying that I don't want them here. I don't want their kids to go to school with my kids. What if they intermarry? Or some saying the Meyers family, they're nice people, but what if other black families come? And one woman even saying in the interview that those people are savages. It'll ruin the community. It'll drive down the price of housing there, and so on. So check that out if you want to learn more. Sometimes the Meyers family would be faced with people outside their lawn, intimidation, broken windows. They actually had 3 crosses burned on their lawn. People would drive by with Confederate flags, and so on. The Pennsylvania governor at the time of the large protests would actually send the state police there, and many people would write to the state governor, some in support and some against. One letter reads, "Governor Leader, dear sir, I think your handling of the Levittown situation is brutal and does not show good judgment on the part of one who is supposed to be the governor of our state. If you had ever lived near those savages, then you would know why people object to their moving into Levittown. Pardon me for not signing my name, for it has reached the point where people like me are not free to express our opinions. Thanks to people like you. See you at the polls." Now another letter in support of what the governor was doing read, "My dear governor, I want to congratulate you for taking prompt action in helping to stop the disgraceful action of mobs against the citizens who want to move into this home in Levittown. Pennsylvania has a noble history in this respect as a center for the Underground Railroad, as the home of Thaddeus Stevens, and it is shameful that a handful of people are attempting to mar it. I urge you to take the strongest action possible against those who would stir up racial antagonisms in this way. Sincerely yours." So the Meyers would stay in that community. Eventually more black families would move in, and it would pave the way towards civil rights. If you want to learn more about race and redlining, you can check out this video from NPR. I will warn you now that they start off with a curse word. Just skip to 30 seconds in when you start it.